إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله الله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله وكفى بالله شهيدا أما بعد فيا عباد الله أوصي نفسي وأوصيكم بتقوى الله عز وجل وقد قال الله جل في علاه في القرآن العظيم بعد أن أقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون وبعد. Of course, we begin by praising and thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. نحمده, we compliment Him. وَنَسْتَعِينُهُ, and we ask Him for help. وَنَسْتَغْفِرُهُ, and we beg for His forgiveness. وَنُؤْمِنُ بِهِ, and we believe in Him. وَنَتَوَكَّلُ عَلَيْهِ, and we put our trust completely in Allah. Whomsoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to guide, no one can lead that person astray. And whomsoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to leave astray, no one can guide that person. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells all of us, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, O you who are committed to faith and iman, ittaqullaha haqqa tuqatihi. Be aware of your relationship with Allah and be cautious, be afraid of breaking that relationship in a way that He deserves. وَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ, and don't give yourself the opportunity to die إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ, except that you're a Muslim. What I want to talk about today is actually a continuation of a khutbah from about 2 weeks ago. I talked about the first two ayat of Surat Al-Qiyamah, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains and clarifies for us beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is in fact a day of judgment. And it is approaching every single one of us, and none of us can avoid it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the second ayah, He links the day of judgment by promising by a type of person who will be successful on that day. When He says, لَا أُقْسِمُ بِالنَّفْسِ اللَّوَّامَةِ, I promise by this person who has the type of behavior that propels them to constantly improve. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises by this person because this is the person who is going to be successful on the day of judgment. The person who always looks back at the actions that they've done, and they look back at the way that they did them, and the ones that they did and the ones they didn't do, and they look to see how they could have done better had they been given the same opportunity again. So this person that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He promises by this type of person, it's a believer who's constantly looking at the things that they've done in the past, the mistakes that they've made, and promising that they won't make those mistakes again. Learning from their past, looking back from this retrospective perspective, and seeing how they could constantly improve themselves. And it could also be a believer who did something good, and they look back at the action that they did, and they see how they could have done it better. How the Prophet ﷺ would do it had he been in that situation. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He promises by this type of person who has this behavior characteristic. And if you have that type of guilt, it's a very positive type of guilt, where you look back at what you did, and it propels you to reach a higher strata of righteousness and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you have that guilt in this world, it might save you from the guilt in the hereafter. And if somebody doesn't have that guilt in this world, where they just live their life and they never look back to evaluate themselves, to judge themselves, to see how they can improve, if they don't have that guilt in this world, in this dunya, then they're going to have the most extreme guilt in the hereafter. Because they'll look back at all the deeds that they did in this dunya, and then they'll be filled with extreme remorse, because they could have easily done a lot better. And there's a really interesting example from the life of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, which is often mentioned when we think about this guilt, looking back at the actions that we've done, so that we can improve ourselves even more. There's usually a mention of Musa alayhi salam, where Musa alayhi salam, he accidentally killed somebody, he felt bad about that, and he made sure he took every opportunity after that point in order to benefit others, in order to do good, so that he never has that guilt feeling again, even though it was an accident. There's also a very famous story of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that's mentioned when we talk about this guilt that propels us to constantly improve. Once Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu was walking in the streets of Medina with Abdurrahman ibn Auf. Both of these guys together, are two very celebrated companions, two companions promised paradise, two people that we look up to and we revere. They're walking in the streets of Medina and it's nighttime. And they see a caravan, a convoy, a big group of people with wagons and merchandise that are passing through the streets of Medina towards the edge of the city. And Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he asks Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he asks him if he wants to stay up during the night and help him guard this caravan. Because Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he's already decided that he's going to stay up during the night and he's going to guard this caravan, make sure nothing happens to the people, and make sure none of the merchandise gets stolen. So he asks Abdurrahman ibn Auf if he wants to join him. And instead of just standing next to the caravan the whole night, they'll pray tahajjud. So they'll take advantage of their time, but at the same time, they'll be there in the proximity of the caravan if anything should go down. So they'll be protecting it as well. So Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he agrees that together they'll protect this caravan. And you might be thinking, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, of course he's a righteous companion and he's taking his time to do this. But what's also important to mention in this instance in his life is that this time Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu was also Amir al-Mu'mineen. He was a leader of the believers. So this is a man with enormous responsibility, being pulled in every direction, but still he's going to stay up the entire night with Abdurrahman ibn Auf, another very famous companion and very big businessman, who again with lots of responsibilities, they're going to stay up and they're going to serve the believers that are passing through the city. So as they're guarding and as they're praying through the night, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he hears a baby crying, like a newborn baby, kind of like the baby we can hear right now. He hears that baby crying in the middle of the night, in the first part of the night. And as this baby is crying profusely, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he decides to investigate. So he goes and he finds this baby that's crying, and it's just a newborn baby, and he tells the mother of this baby boy to feed this baby. Because he's a newborn, so he says, feed him some milk so he can stop crying because he's starving, he's screaming from hunger. So the mother says, okay, and then Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he walks away. Later on in the night, again he hears that same baby crying very profusely. So he goes up again to the mother and he tells her to feed the baby some milk so he'll stop crying. She says, okay, and he walks away. And then later again, third time, in the middle of the night, he hears this baby crying profusely, and he goes to the mother, and he says, you're not a good mother if you're not feeding this baby when he's crying out of hunger. And so this mother, she says to Umar, she says, I'm trying to wean him off. Like even though he's an infant, I'm trying to get him out of the habit of drinking milk. And Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he says, why? He's just an infant, he needs milk, he needs that nourishment. She says, because I'm a poor person, and in the city that I live in, Umar, she lives in the land of the believers, and she says, Umar, our leader, she doesn't know she's talking to Umar, she says, Umar, our leader, he has instituted that if you're in poverty, you get a government-funded allowance based on the number of people in your family, but a baby doesn't count unless he doesn't drink milk, unless he's weaned off. So he'll count as a dependent if he doesn't drink milk. So she says, I'm trying to wean him off, and that way I can get more money for my family to take care of them. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, she doesn't know she's talking to Umar. Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, his face fills with regret because he realizes that his administration has a policy that's causing this baby to scream from hunger, and this mother is not providing her baby the right nourishment because she wants more money out of the administration based on the rule that they've placed in effect. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he's filled with extreme regret and extreme guilt based on this policy. And eventually when the night passes, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he goes to the masjid and he leads the believers in Fajr prayer. And one of the companions, he mentioned, when he was leading us in prayer, he was crying so much, there were parts of the recitation, we couldn't make out what words he was saying, because he was crying so profusely. And after the prayer, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, still thinking about that policy that he mandated, and the effects that it's having on certain babies on the land of the believers, he says to himself, he says, Ya Umar, kam qatalta min atfal al-muslimin. How many of the Muslim babies have you killed? Meaning how many kids have been affected by this policy? So he thinks back at this policy, the effects that it has, but it empowers him to improve and to make a better decision. So later on in the day, he tells his staff to go to the land of the believers and tell them that if anybody is getting government-funded allowances, they get it per child, despite the age of that child, or despite whether he's feeding or not. So feed your child as long as it's appropriate. So he looks back at the decision, and he sees the effects of it, and he figures out a way to make it better, and he improves. And this is exemplified. He's exemplified a nafs al-lawama, this nafs that's constantly trying to improve. After Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this type of soul that's going to be successful on the Day of Judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He shows us the other end of this spectrum. People who completely deny the Day of Judgment. People who don't live as if there is a Day of Judgment. And in fact, people who go up to other people and make fun of them if they believe in the Day of Judgment. In the next ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, أَيَحْسَبُ الْإِنسَانُ أَن لَن نَجْمَعَ عِظَامًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He reiterates the claim that some people have, where some people say that I'm going to live in this world, and after my demise, after my death, I'm going to cease to exist. My bones are going to decay in the ground, and that's going to be the end of my entire existence. Which of course we know to be falsehood, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the first ayah, He mentioned that of course there's a Day of Judgment. And He emphasizes that this Day of Judgment is a very real day, and everyone will pass through it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions this claim that some people have, and He mentions it as an assumption. So there are people out there who have a baseless assumption that when they die, that's it, and nothing else is going to happen after that. And we know this, of course, not to be true. And if for a moment, if we could just hear the millions of people that are in their graves right now, the things that they're saying, where some of them are happy because they see a window of Jannah, where some of them are screaming because of the pain that they're in, if we could just for a moment just hear the millions of people in their graves, we would know that of course that this is something very real. But the only time we can see those things is when we're part of the unseen world ourselves. And at that point, of course, it'll be too late. But we have the advantage that the Prophet ﷺ, he's informed us of things that are happening in the grave right now. So there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where once he was walking with some of his companions past a grave. And the Prophet ﷺ, he could hear what was happening in the grave. So he asked one of the companions, he said, "Man sahibu hadha al-qabr?" Whose grave is this? And the companions answered, "It's so and so." Then the Prophet ﷺ, he told them what the person in the grave was hoping for, what he was saying, and what he was praying for, so that the companions could understand what happens to some people in the grave. And so it's something that's very worthwhile for us to listen to, because it's something that nobody else in this world could tell us except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the master and the knower of the unseen. The Prophet ﷺ, he told the companions that for the person in this grave, he said, "Raka'atani ahabbu ila hadha min baqiyati dunyakum." He said, for this person, just the opportunity to become alive and to pray just 2 rak'ah, nothing else. But just to have that one moment in life again, to pray 2 extra rak'ah that they weren't able to do when they were alive, for them, that is more beloved. For the person in that grave, it's more beloved for him to do that than the rest of your entire life. Meaning he doesn't want like a life again. He doesn't want a full life. He just wants to be resurrected, or he just wants life again. Enough just to pray 2 more rak'ah. So we can take heed from this lesson, and we can understand that I myself am also going to be in my grave. And do I want to be in a situation where I'm screaming and begging for the opportunity just for 2 more rak'ah, when I already know this lesson right now while I'm alive? So I can take advantage of that and pray as many extra rak'ah and nawafil prayers, so that I can, when I'm in my grave, instead of being a time where I'm begging for mercy from punishment, in fact I'm looking towards a window of Jannah and smelling the beauty of the hereafter that's to come and all the good that's to come. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions this claim of some people that they believe that their bones won't be resurrected again. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "Bala qadirina ala an nusawwiya banana." Not only is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala going to recreate us as human beings in the flesh, not just our bones and our muscles, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says we're fully capable to recreate the human being down to his fingertips. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions down to your fingertips to mean down to the finest details, down to your fingernails. Those details in your body that maybe only you know about, like a birthmark or something, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's going to recreate you down to the finest detail. He's fully capable of that. It's not any more difficult for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to tweak the finer parts of the human being than to recreate the bigger parts, like the bones or the muscles. And in this is another very powerful lesson for us, in that if I were to wake up on the Day of Judgment, and my nails were different than they were in this dunya, chances are I wouldn't even notice. You probably wouldn't even notice if a small little detail was different, because there's so much more important things happening on the Day of Judgment. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He's fully capable, and He will in fact recreate you down to your finest detail. And we know from our fingertips also includes our fingerprints. So that unique fingerprint that every human being has, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to recreate you down to that detail. And this fingertip also includes our fingernail, something which we cut off and we throw away every week or twice a week, whatever the case may be. And it's something when we throw it away, we never think about it. So like, for example, if you cut your nails today, if you cut your nails yesterday, and you threw them in the garbage, you're not thinking about them, right? Because you cut them off and you throw them away. Even though they're a part of your body, you don't think about them. You don't say, okay, what are my nails doing right now? Right? It's not like your finger or something like that. So it's something that's completely worthless in a sense, where you don't think about it at all. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's even going to recreate those things which you give it no importance, but still Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to recreate it down to your finest details. And in the past, there were people, for example, to avoid identification, they were trying to burn off their fingertips so that they couldn't be identified. Some criminals would do that. And scholars in the past, they used to mention that criminals on the Day of Judgment, they won't be able to escape, even if they burn their fingertips in this dunya, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's going to recreate every part of them. So if there's anything, like if you change your face, your identity, you completely change who you are, your eye color, to avoid any identification, it won't help you escape identification on the Day of Judgment. Every single human being is going to be held accountable, and every single human being is going to pass through this judgment. And based on the judgment and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they might get the judgment of goodness or the judgment of bad. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, still talking about this person who says that there is no Day of Judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, بَلْ يُرِيدُ الْإِنسَانُ لِيَفْجُرَ أَمَامًا. This same human being who denies the existence of the Day of Judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us one reason why he doesn't believe in the Day of Judgment. He says, لِيَفْجُرَ أَمَامًا. Because this person, he wants to continue in sin. Meaning, if there's a person who says there is no Day of Judgment, he also wants there to be no Day of Judgment. Because if there's a person out there who claims there is no Day of Judgment, if he's wrong, then he's in the worst possible situation imaginable. So for him, he wants there to be no Day of Judgment, even if he feels he's wrong. So if he says there is no Day of Judgment, he's going to urge and pressure you to believe that there is no Day of Judgment. Because if there's the slightest chance that he's wrong, then his entire life goes down the drain. He wasted his one and only opportunity to have, as well as to continue in his sin. Because if there is a Day of Judgment, then that means there's rules imposed on a person. That means there's accountability. That means there's consequences for your actions. But the human being who says there is no Day of Judgment, he doesn't want to be confined by any rules. He doesn't want to live by any doctrine, and he doesn't want there to be a hereafter, because he wants to fulfill his desires in this world, and he doesn't want a Day of Judgment so that he's not held accountable for his actions. So over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives us psychological insight inside the mind of a person who says that there is no Day of Judgment, because he doesn't want to live by any rules. When we know, in fact, that of course there is a Day of Judgment, and living by those rules is what is going to ensure earning the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. So people will urge you to believe the same way. Your peers or your co-workers or your neighbors might urge the same doctrine upon you. Well, they'll tell you, live life to the max. You only have one life. And they'll tell you things like that. When in fact, you only have one death, but you live twice. You live in this dunya, and then you live again in the hereafter. And so this concept of living life to the max, and this is the one and only opportunity that you have to live and fulfill your desires and enjoy the dunya, is of course full of falsehood. Because the person who believes in the hereafter, he is the one who's going to have the maximum fulfillment of utility and happiness, because he lived in this world according to the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in the hereafter he gets eternal paradise and Jannah in order to fulfill all of his desires. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَكُمْ فِيهَا مَا تَشْتَهِي أَنفُسُكُمْ. That in Jannah you can have whatever you want. And so if you really want ultimate happiness, fulfillment of all your desires, living life to the max, then it can only happen in the hereafter. Because on top of getting anything that you want, you also get to live there forever. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a different ayah, He says, what a great place to live and reside in forever, when He talks about Jannah. That this is the best place to live in forever. Even if you lived in another place that was really nice forever, you would get bored of it. But Jannah is not like that. In that even when you live there forever, you can't comprehend it, but you'll never get bored of it. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives us the behavior and the characteristic of those like the companions and the prophets, so that we can constantly improve ourselves in order to obey and live in the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to earn His eternal paradise. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. عباد الله اذكروا الله العظيم يذكركم ودعوه يستجب لكم واشكروه على نعمه يزدكم ولذكر الله أكبر وأعلى وأجل وأقم الصلاة.